So how do we go about replicating at the leadership level? I'm glad you asked. This is like a softball. I'm so glad you asked this. This is the single biggest pragmatic change in my ministry over the last 20 years, without question. When as a senior pastor, and I know most of you all are probably ministers of education or groups pastors, discipleship pastors, and so you need to go back and tell me and I'll call your senior pastor and tell him this. They may not care if I call them or not, but I'll tell them anyway. The biggest change for me as a senior pastor happened the day I stopped thinking of my primary responsibility as a corporate disciple maker and began seeing my responsibility as a personal disciple maker. So for me, that meant every week intentionally pouring into a small group of people. And I mean, the numbers here are staggering. You all have thought about this before, but I ran the numbers multiple times myself. If I disciple 3 people for a year, and at the end of that year, I turn them loose, and I expect them to do the same thing. And then at the end of the second year, me and those 3, they're discipling 3 more, and all the people they discipled. And so you see the exponential idea here. 21 years. That's how long it takes for every single person on the planet to be discipled. Every person in your church can be discipled in under a decade. If the pastor or a leader will commit to discipling 2 or 3 people a year, personally. And so one of my mentors, pastored this really large church, been there for almost 40 years, started when they had 85, 90 people, grew it to 4,500. I love this guy. He was everything I always wanted to be. And I remember asking him one day, what's the most important thing you do? And I thought he was going to say, well, I preach to 4,500 people every weekend. And he didn't. He said, the most important thing I do is I preach to 3 people, disciple 3 people every week in my office. And he said, I did the math, Micah. It takes like 6 years for me to see far more people discipled than we see just coming to hear me preach on a weekly basis. And you can tell your pastors I said this. We've looked at the numbers. Life change happens in discipleship environments at like 4 to 5 times the rate of life change that happens in a preaching context in a Sunday morning. It's astonishing the difference. I'm preaching to the choir. You all understand that. So for me, how did we begin to change this at our church? I had to personally start discipling people. I'm a volunteer pastor at my church right now. Every Thursday morning, 6 a.m., Dunkin' Donuts, I meet with 2 young guys in our church. They're both 27 years old. One's owns an insurance company. One's a dentist, and I'm discipling them. We didn't meet this morning because one of them's wife is pregnant, and they were in the hospital all night last night. Got out 3:30 this morning. Contractions stopped, and the doctor got them stopped and got them sent home. So we didn't get to meet this morning. But typically, week in and week out, Dunkin' Donuts, 6 a.m., we meet so that we can meet before we all have to go to work. And this is just something that I'm committed to. My wife's in the back. She's got a woman that she's doing the exact same thing with. In fact, and this is a little extreme, we're kicking around the idea, I probably shouldn't even say it because who knows it'll happen, but we're kicking around the idea of opening our home and putting someone in our home for a year at a time, having them live with us so that he can be with me all the time so that we can model for them what it looks like. So I think this starts with your top leadership, personally disciple making. And then for me, I made it a job requirement for everybody on staff. I had to be able to walk up to every single person on staff and I had to be able to say to them at any given time, tell me the names of who you're discipling, when you meet, and where you meet. And you had to be able to, on the spot, tell me as a senior pastor, this is who I'm discipling, this is when we meet, and this is where we meet. So trying to create this culture of disciple making. So I think that's got to be the model. I think we've got to, I call it the model of Jesus. Narrow your disciple making focus and expand your disciple-making influence. That's functionally what we're doing. Narrow your focus, expand your influence. It's not as sexy, it takes longer, but I think it's far more thorough. So that's what I would do. Yes, sir.